There is a particular cruelty in handing someone a ruin and calling it a gift. When a penniless girl of 18 was named the only heir to a dead duke's forgotten manor, everyone who mattered agreed it was a joke. A crumbling house on a cold and empty moor, left to a nobody with a few coins to her name, so polite society might watch the place swallow her whole. She came expecting damp and silence and slow decay. What she found instead was a door at the end of a dark corridor, locked for years. And behind it, the one truth a powerful family had buried everything to keep. Sidoni Marrow had learned young that the world kept its promises only when they were cruel ones. She sat now on the hard bench of a hired cart, her single trunk roped behind her, and watched the moor unspool through a thin gray mist. It was country that seemed to have given up on color. Brown heather, black peat, a sky the flat, dull shade of an old coin. The wind came off the high ground in long, cold breaths that found every worn seam of her cloak. She had stopped shivering an hour ago, which she understood was not a good sign. She was 18 years old. She had 4 shillings knotted into the corner of a handkerchief, a letter folded 3 times against her ribs, and no earthly notion of what she was traveling toward. The letter had come on a Tuesday, carried up to the boarding house by a pot boy who had to be told his own errand. It bore a London seal and a solicitor's heavy hand, and it informed Miss Sidoni Marrow, in words so cold they might have been chipped from slate, that she was the sole surviving heir to the Manor of Marchmore, lately the property of His Grace the Duke of Wykehaven, deceased. She had read it 7 times before the words would hold still. She had no people. That was the first strange thing. Her mother had died when Sidoni was small and had left behind a tin locket, a habit of silence about the past, and a debt to the parish that Sidoni had been working off ever since. For 6 years she had scrubbed the stairs and kept the accounts of Mrs. Beeching's lodging house in exchange for a cot in the eaves and whatever food the lodgers left. She had never heard the name Wykehaven in her life. She could not think why a duke or a duke's lawyer should have heard of hers. When she read the letter aloud in the kitchen, the lodgers laughed until they wept. A manor, they crowed. Our scrubbing girl, a lady of the manor. Only the solicitor's clerk, a narrow man named Aldous Craik, who arrived a week later to see her sign, had not laughed. He had watched her with the patient attention of a man watching a mouse decide to enter a trap. The manor was worthless, Mr. Craik explained, in the tone of one doing her a great kindness. Marchmore had stood shut and empty for years. It carried no income, only the cost of its own slow collapse. A sensible young woman would sign the property over to the estate for a small consideration and think no more of it. He had the papers ready. He had a pen already inked. Sidoni had looked at that inked pen a long time. Then she had asked why, if the place was worth nothing, a gentleman had come all the way from London to relieve her of it. Mr. Craik's patient face had not moved, but something behind his eyes had gone very still. And in that stillness, she had read the truth. The manor was not worthless. It was only worthless to her. She had refused to sign. She had spent nearly all she owned on the journey north instead. And now here she was, being carried toward a house nobody wanted her to have. The cart lurched to a halt where the track forked between 2 leaning gateposts. The carter, who had not spoken in an hour, turned and looked at her from under the dripping brim of his hat. "That's Marchmore. Up the rise," he said, and jerked his chin at the mist. "I'll set your box here. I'll not take the cart a yard past that gate." Sidoni peered through the murk and saw nothing but gray. "Why not?" she asked. The carter was already sawing the ropes loose. "Nobody's been up to that house in years, miss," he said. "The old duke shut it and sealed it, and never came again. And folk hereabouts learned not to ask what for. And he would not finish the thought, only set her trunk in the mud, took his coins, and turned the cart for home, as though something behind him were watching him go. Sidoni stood alone in the road until the sound of the wheels had drowned in the wind. Then she took the leather handle of her trunk in both hands and began to drag it up the rise. Marchmore Hall came out of the mist the way a drowned thing comes up out of a pond, all at once and wrong. It was a long, low house of dark stone, older than any fashion, its many windows shuttered or blind with grime. Ivy had climbed it and then died on it, leaving a brown skeleton of stems across the walls. The chimneys stood cold. Not one thread of smoke rose from the whole vast bulk of it, and the front door, when she reached it, had been boarded across with 2 planks nailed corner to corner, as though someone had wanted to be certain the house stayed shut. She had no strength left for despair. She set down her trunk, made a fist, and beat on the boards until the side of her hand ached. For a long while there was only the wind. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, a bolt scraped. A second bolt. A key turned in an iron lock with a sound like a cough, and a narrow gap opened between the planks where one had been pried loose from within. A woman looked out at her. She was old and upright, dressed in gray so worn it had gone the color of the walls, and her face had the shut, watchful hardness of a door that has learned to stay closed. Her eyes went over Sidoni once, the mud, the thin cloak, the battered trunk, and came back cold. "The house is not open," the woman said. "There is nothing for you here. Go back the way you came." "I cannot," Sidoni said. "I have nowhere to go back to. My name is Sidoni Merrow, and by the will of the late Duke of Wickhaven, this house is mine." The change in the old woman's face was small but total. The hardness did not soften. It sharpened, as ice hardens the colder the night grows. For a moment, Sidoni thought the door would simply shut again. Instead, the woman stepped back, and the gap widened, and cold air breathed out of the house that was somehow colder than the moor. "I am Mrs. Truscott," the woman said. "I have kept this house since before you were born. You had best come in then, and see what you have inherited." Inside, Marchmore was a corpse of a house. Furniture stood under gray sheets like snowdrifts. Dust lay thick and undisturbed on every rail and sill, and their footsteps woke long echoes in rooms Sidoni could not see. It smelled of cold ash and old stone, and something underneath that she could not name, faint and sweet and sad. Mrs. Truscott carried a single candle and did not look back to see whether Sidoni followed. She showed her the great hall, the shrouded dining room, the library with its shelves stripped bare. She named each room in a flat voice and moved on before Sidoni could ask a question. Only when they came to the end of a long, narrow corridor in the oldest part of the house did she stop. At the corridor's end stood a door. It was not like the others. It was banded with black iron, and across it hung a chain and a padlock heavy enough to moor a boat, and the wood around the lock was scored pale with old marks, as though hands or tools had worked at it and failed. The dust that lay everywhere else in the house did not lie evenly here. Someone, at some time, had stood before this door often enough to wear a path. Sidoni stopped. "What is that room?" she asked. Mrs. Truscott did not turn. The candle flame stood perfectly still in the dead air. "That door stays shut," she said. "The old Duke had it sealed with his own hands, and there is no key in this house that opens it, nor will you find one by looking. Whatever else you meddle with, mistress, you leave that be." "But the house is mine," Sidoni said. "Every room in it." "The house," said Mrs. Truscott, "is His Grace's until the law says otherwise, and His Grace, the young Duke of Wickhaven, will be down from the court within the week to ask by what right You are standing in it." Then she lifted the candle and looked at Sidoni full in the face for the first time, and there was something in her hard old eyes that was not quite unkindness, that was almost, terribly, like pity. "You should not have come, girl," she said quietly. "There are things in this house that were buried for mercy's sake." And from behind the iron door, so faint that Sidoni would spend the rest of the night telling herself she had imagined it, something answered. A single slow scratch, low against the wood, as if it had been waiting a very long time to be heard. For 3 days, Sidoni Marrow made war on the dead house, and slowly the dead house gave ground. She could not warm all of it. She could not even warm most of it. But she found a small parlor off the kitchen with a chimney that still drew, and she swept it, and she burned a broken chair for want of anything better, and she made herself a corner where a person might sit without seeing her own breath. She shook out sheets that had gone stiff as boards. She found a barrel of tallow candles under the back stairs and a sack of oats the mice had mostly claimed, and she made do. She had spent 6 years making do. It was the one trade she had ever been properly taught. Behind the steward's office, she found something better than candles. She found the muniment room, a windowless closet lined with chests, and every chest was full of paper, the whole memory of the estate left to molder in the dark. She did not yet know what any of it was worth, but a girl who has kept a lodging-house solvent on nothing knows that paper is never nothing, and she marked the room in her mind and shut the door on it for later. Mrs. Truscott watched all of it with the flat patience of an old cat. She did not help. After the first day, she did not hinder either. When Sidoni asked a question, the old woman answered in the fewest words she could find. But on the second evening, over the broth, she said one thing unasked. "Do not be here," she said, "when his grace comes. He is not a gentle man, and this house hasn't made him one. There was a fire years back, and folk died in it, and he came out of it marked as you have seen, and he shut this place the same season and has hated it ever since. Whatever you have heard of him in the town, it is kinder than the truth." Then she took the empty bowl and would say no more. When Sidoni asked about the iron door, she would not answer at all, only pressed her lips white and left the room. So Sidoni stopped asking and watched instead. She learned that Mrs. Truscott never went down that corridor and never once let Sidoni go down it alone. On the second night, when the old woman was asleep, Sidoni went down it alone. She took a candle and the fire iron, and she stood before the door a long while, listening. There was nothing. She set her hand to the padlock. It was the size of her fist and cold enough to burn, and it did not so much as rattle in its chain. She worked the iron into the loop of it and leaned her whole slight weight on the bar until bright spots swam in her eyes, and the lock did not care. Whoever had shut this door had meant it to hold against a stronger arm than hers. When she gave up and turned, Mrs. Truscott stood at the far end of the corridor with a candle of her own, watching, saying nothing. Neither of them spoke of it in the morning, but there was a new thing between them after that. Not warmth, a kind of grim understanding, the understanding of two people who share a locked room and do not agree about it. The Duke of Wykehaven came on the third day, in the last gray hour before dark, and he came in a storm. Sidoni heard the horses before she heard the men, hooves ringing on the flooded track, and then a hammering at the boarded door so hard the planks jumped in their nails. Mrs. Truscott went the color of tallow. "Stay in the parlor," she said, the first fear Sidoni had heard in her voice. And of course, Sidoni did not. She followed the old woman into the great hall and stood at the foot of the dead staircase while the bolts were drawn. He filled the doorway the way weather fills it. He was tall and lean and dressed in black soaked blacker by the rain, and he came in out of the dark, without waiting to be asked, pulling off his hat, shaking the water from it onto the marble, as though the house and everyone in it already belonged to him. He was younger than she had expected, and harder than she had feared. Down the left side of his jaw and neck, the skin was drawn and shining. An old burn healed badly, and it pulled the corner of his mouth into something that was not a smile and never would be. He wore gloves though he was indoors. His eyes, when they found her across the hall, were the pale gray of a winter sky, and there was nothing in them she could use. So, he said, the scrubbing girl who would be a duchess. I am no one's duchess, Sidonie said. I am the owner of this house. You are a squatter in a house you have never earned, standing in the wreck of a name you cannot even spell, he said, and he crossed the hall toward her, slow and deliberate, like a man crossing ground he means to take. Craik tells me a foundling scullery maid has been named in my father's will. I told him it was a forgery or madness. I have ridden 2 days up from town through this filthy weather to put it right. So let us put it right. You will sign the paper Craik set before you. You will take the coach fare I am generous enough to offer, and you will be gone from my county by morning, and I will never hear the word Marchmore spoken in the same breath as your name again. Sidonie's heart was slamming, but she had stood in front of angry people her whole life, and she had learned that the ones who shouted were rarely the ones to fear. This one had not raised his voice at all. I refuse to sign Mr. Craik's paper in the town, she said, and I will refuse it here. If the will is a forgery, Your Grace, prove it in a court, and I will go quietly. But you have not called it a forgery. You have called it a madness. Those are different words, and you chose the second, and I think you chose it because you are afraid the first is a lie. The hall went very still. Mrs. Truscott made a small sound. The Duke stopped astride from her, and for a long moment he looked at her as though she were a sum that had come out wrong. You know nothing about this house, he said. Quieter now. I know it was sealed and boarded by a man who then left it and never came back, she said. I know there is a room in it no key will open, and a woman who has kept it alone for a lifetime and will not say why, and a lawyer who calls it worthless and travels 2 days to steal it. I know your father left it to a stranger over the head of his own son. I do not know what any of it means, but I know it means something, and I know you know what, and I know you would rather freeze me off your land than say it aloud. He did not answer that. His gaze moved past her, and she saw him take in what she had not meant him to see. The one swept corner, the broken chair fed to the grate, the single mean fire, the sheets she had dragged down to make a bed by the kitchen where the chimney drew. She saw him understand, all at once, that she had been living in a corpse of a house on oats and tallow, and would go on doing it, rather than take his coach fare and run. Something in his face changed. It did not soften exactly. It was more that a mask he had not known he wore slipped for half a breath and let her see the tiredness underneath. He looked, in that moment, less like a duke come to evict a beggar, and more like a man who had spent years being cold and had forgotten there was any other way to be. He turned from her without a word and walked into the great front room, where the main hearth stood black and dead, and had stood dead for years. He looked at it a long moment. Then, to her astonishment, the Duke of Wykehaven pulled off one glove and then the other, and knelt at his own ruined hearth like a servant, and began to build a fire. His left hand was a map of the same bad burn that marked his face, the fingers stiff and shining, and he used it anyway, laying the kindling she had cut, striking the flint she had left, coaxing the flame up out of nothing with a patience she would not have believed of him. He did not look at her while he did it. When it caught, and the light of it climbed his scarred face, he stayed kneeling a moment longer than the fire needed him to. "You will not sleep in a kitchen in my father's house," he said to the flames. "Whatever you are not that." And then he stood, and turned, and saw the locket. It had come loose from her collar when she bent to the hearth beside him, a small, dented tin thing on a bit of ribbon, the only object in the world that had been her mother's. His eyes fixed on it, and every other thing went out of his face. The color left him. He took one step toward her, and stopped as though a wall had risen out of the floor between them. "Where?" he said, and his voice was not the same voice at all. "Where did you get that?" "It was my mother's," Sidoni said. She did not understand what she was looking at. The Duke of Wickhaven, who had come through the storm to throw her out with the ease of a man brushing lint from his sleeve, was staring at a farthing's worth of dented tin as though it had spoken his name. His burned hand had come halfway up toward it and stopped in the air. "Your mother," he repeated. "What was she called?" "Marrow," Sidoni said. "Anne Marrow." Her voice caught, because she had learned long ago that questions about her mother led nowhere but grief. "She died when I was 6. She was a seamstress, and she left me nothing in the world but this locket and a great silence, and I have been told, my whole life, that we came from nobody at all. Whatever you think you see, Your Grace, you are mistaken. My mother was not grand enough to have crossed a shadow of yours." For a moment she was certain he would tell her. She saw it move behind his eyes, some heavy thing straining at a chain. Then the mask came down again, smooth and complete, and the Duke of Wickhaven she had first met in the doorway was back, cold and closed and certain of everything. "Cover it," he said. "Put it away and do not let Craik see it. That, at least, I will tell you for nothing." He did not sleep at Marchmoor. He rode the 2 hours to Wickhaven Court through the tail of the storm rather than pass a night under that roof. And Sidoni lay awake in the parlor by the fire he had built for her and listened to the rain and turned his warning over and over. Do not let Craik see it. Do not let Craik take it. See it. As though the danger of the little tin thing lay only in being looked at by the right pair of eyes. In the morning, a wagon came up the rise from the court, and it did not carry a paper to sign. It carried coal and flour and a side of bacon and lamp oil and a bolt of plain gray wool, and a curt note in a hand she already knew, written not to her, but at her. See that the house does not fall down before the courts decide who it falls on. Mrs. Truscott read it over her shoulder and made a sound that might, in a warmer woman, have been a laugh. "He has not sent so much as a candle to this house in 15 years, she said. "Whatever you showed him last night, girl, put it away, and keep it away." He came back on the Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He told himself, and told her, that he came to see his property was not being stripped and sold. He walked the cold rooms with his hands behind his back, and found nothing being stripped and sold, because Sidoni was doing the opposite, putting the house in order, a room at a time, methodically, honestly, the way she had once kept a lodging house from ruin. And she was reading. She had opened the muniment room and begun, for want of any other use for a mind that had never once been allowed to rest, to sort the estate papers chest by chest. On his third visit, she found the nerve to ask him the thing she had wondered since the first night. He was standing at a window watching the sleet, his gloved hands behind him, and she said, quietly, so Mrs. Truscott would not hear, "The fire that marked you. Was it here? Was it in this house?" She thought he would not answer. The sleet ticked at the glass. Then he said, without turning, "It was here. There was a wing of this house that does not stand any more. I was 19. I went into it because there was someone I could not leave in it, and I came out again, and she did not, and my father sealed what was left of that wing and this corridor, and never spoke of it again, nor did I. His voice was perfectly even, which was worse than if it had shaken. So you will understand, Miss Marrow, that when a stranger asks me what lies behind a locked door in this house, I do not hear an idle question. I hear a hand reaching toward a grave. Sidoni said she was sorry and meant it, and he inclined his head a fraction and did not thank her, and neither of them spoke again of the fire. But something had shifted. A cold man had let her stand for a moment in the cold place where he lived, and had not, afterward, punished her for having seen it. It was on his 4th visit that he stopped pretending the visits were about the roof. He found her in the muniment room at dusk, with 3 lamps burning and ledgers open across every surface, ink to the wrist, a smudge of it on her cheek. He stood in the doorway and watched her work a while before he spoke, and when he spoke, the edge had gone out of his voice. "You have a system," he said. "I have a mess," she said, not looking up. "Your family's mess. Somebody has kept 2 sets of figures for this estate for a very long time, Your Grace, and done it badly, and I have nearly worked out which of the 2 is the lie." He came and stood over the table. She braced for him to sweep it all shut and tell her the accounts of Wykehaven were no business of a scrubbing girl. Instead, he drew out the chair opposite, like a man sitting down to a game he has decided to play, and he looked where she pointed, and he listened. What she laid before him was this: that Marchmoor, which Craik called worthless, had for 30 years quietly earned a small, steady income from the leases of its outlying farms. That the income had never once appeared in the accounts his father kept. That it had gone instead into a separate book in a separate hand, and had been paid out year upon year to a single recipient, the book named only as the keeping. And that when the old Duke died, the payments had not stopped. They were still going out. Someone was still being kept. And the man who signed the order that moved the money quarter after quarter in the careful hand of a lawyer covering his tracks was Aldous Craik. Sidoni had turned the word over in her mind for days. The keeping. It was a strange, careful word, chosen by a man who did not want to write a name. She looked up at him across the lamps. "Someone is being kept," she said slowly. "Not paid. Not pensioned. Kept. One keeps a secret, Your Grace. One keeps a prisoner. One keeps a grave. Which of the 3 is it?" And she watched the shudder come down over his face, and knew she had struck near the bone, because he did not tell her she was wrong. He said only, in a voice gone flat and final, "Leave that word alone, Miss Marrow. It has cost this family more than you can guess. But a man does not warn you off a word that means nothing. So you see, Your Grace, why I would not sign his paper," Sidoni said, and set down her pen. "A worthless house does not need a lawyer to travel 2 days to bury it. Marchmoor is not worthless. It is dangerous. It has paid for a secret for 30 years, and your Mr. Craik has his hand on the purse, and my name on that. Will is the only thing between him and full ownership of whatever the money has been keeping." The Duke was silent a long time. The lamps hissed. Outside, an owl went over the yard. "Then we will not wait for Craik to move first," he said. "We will answer his paper with one of our own." And so, that same evening, at the same ink-stained table, they wrote a letter together, she framing it, and he correcting it, until it said in 3 cold lines exactly what they meant it to say: that Miss Sidoni Marrow accepted the inheritance of Marchmoor in full and would defend it at law; that she required, as owner, a complete accounting of all sums drawn upon the estate these 30 years, and that any person who had drawn such sums without her leave would shortly be asked to explain himself before a magistrate. She signed it in her own plain hand. The Duke sealed it in wax with his own ring, which made it not the letter of a scrubbing girl at all, and they sent it to London on the morning coach. "That will wake him," the Duke said, almost with pleasure. "Yes," said Sidoni, watching the coach dwindle down the white road. "But it will also tell him precisely where I am, and precisely what I am looking for." She turned back to the house. "We had better find it, Your Grace, before he decides to come and find it first." The Duke did not answer at once. He was watching her the way he had watched her since the night of the locket, as though she were at once the answer to a question he had carried for years, and the very last thing on earth he wished the answer to be. "Find it we shall," he said at last. "But when we do, Miss Marrow, I fear neither of us will be glad that we looked." Winter closed its fist on the moor, and inside, March Moor, the house came slowly back to life around the two women and the Ledgers. A girl from the court arrived to do the rough work, a broad, silent creature named Peggy, who could carry a hod of coal in each hand and would not gossip, and with her came the means to keep 3 rooms warm instead of 1. Truscott, who had watched the first wagon come up the rise with the face of a woman watching the tide refuse her command, began, grudgingly, to keep house again, because a housekeeper with a house to keep is a different animal from a jailer with a tomb to guard. She unshrouded the parlor. She blacked the kitchen range until it threw back the firelight. She said nothing kind to Sidoni, and never would. But she began, in the evenings, to leave a cup of broth at the muniment room door without a word, and Sidoni came to understand that from Mrs. Truscott this was a kind of love. And Sidoni worked. She had never in her life been given a task worthy of her, and now she had one, and she went at it the way a starved thing goes at a meal. The estate of Wykehaven had been kept in chaos for a generation, and she came to see that the chaos wasn't carelessness. It was cover. A tidy account can be checked in an afternoon. A mountain of muddled ones cannot, unless someone is willing to sit in the cold and go through them line by line for 100 nights together. And no one, in 30 years, had been fool enough or free enough to try. Sidoni was both. She built her own clean books beside the dirty ones. She found the year the false figures began. She found the small sums skimmed from every quarter and dressed as repairs to buildings that had already fallen, as feed for horses long since dead, as wages to servants who had never drawn breath. 3p here, £3 there, a slow river of it running quietly out of the estate and into the pocket of the man who kept the books. The Duke had taken to coming most days now, and no longer troubled to pretend it was the roof. He would sit across the muniment table with a cup of Mrs. Truscott's coffee going cold at his elbow, and read where she told him to read, and once, finding her hunched and blue-lipped over the figures because she had given the day's coal to the bedrooms and kept none for herself, he had said nothing at all. But the next morning, the wagon brought a small iron stove for the muniment room and a proper astral lamp that did not gutter, and a shawl of good Scottish wool folded on top with no note. He did not mention it when he came, neither did she, but she wore the shawl, and he saw that she wore it, and something passed between them across the table that neither would have called by any name. They fell, without deciding to, into the rhythm of two people who work well together. He learned that she thought better aloud and stopped interrupting her when she did. She learned that his coldness was a kind of shudder he could raise a little in a warm room, late, when the work was going well. He told her one night about the tenants, which ones were honest and which drank, which farms were failing and why, and she understood that he was not making conversation. He was handing her the knowledge she would need, that he had begun, without admitting it, to treat her not as a squatter to be tolerated, but as the mistress of the place she claimed to be. It was the first respect anyone had ever paid her that cost the giver something, and it went to her head more than wine. Then, on a gray afternoon in the first week of the year, Peggy carried in the London post, and among it was a letter from Aldous Craig, and it did not answer their letter at all. It was addressed to the Duke, and it was very short and very civil, and it made the hair rise on Sidney's arms. Mr. Craig was concerned, he wrote, to hear that His Grace had fallen under the influence of a young person of no family and doubtful history, who had insinuated herself into the estate. Mr. Craig felt it his duty, as the late Duke's man of business, to come north himself and see the matter regularized. He would arrive within the fortnight. He trusted he would find the young person gone, for her own sake, as questions were being asked in London about who she was and where she had come from, and whether she was entitled to the name she used at all. "He is frightened," the Duke said, reading it a second time. "And when Craig is frightened, he is at his most dangerous, because a frightened man with a lawyer's mind does not fight you. He unmakes you on paper." He looked at her across the little stove. "Whatever is in these chests, Miss Marrow, we have until the fortnight to find it, or he will bury it, and you together." So Sidney did not sleep much that week, and it was on the 7th night, at the very bottom of the last chest, under the ordinary dross of an ordinary estate, that she found it. It was a small chest inside the great one, and it was locked, and the key to it was tied to the underside of the lid above, with a scrap of the same black ribbon that had bound the papers in the Duke's own desk. Inside were not accounts. Inside was a bundle of letters, unsent, in the old Duke's hand, and a lock of pale, fine hair, and a single sheet of heavy paper folded small. She had promised him the truth the moment she found it. She knew that. But her own name was on the folded sheet, and a person will forgive herself a great deal for the sight of her own name where it has no business being, and so she unfolded it alone, by the light of the one good lamp, with the frost ticking on the black window. It was a record of a birth. It gave a day in the reign of the old king, and a place she had never heard spoken, and a child, a daughter, and the mother's name was written plain in a hand that shook, Anne. And below it, where the father's name should stand, there was no name at all, only one word, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had torn through it, as though the man who wrote it had been holding down something that fought him. Mine. Sidney sat very still. Her mother's name. Her mother's hair, pale and fine, the color of her own. A daughter, born in secret, and a great man's torn confession of her, hidden 30 years at the bottom of a locked chest in a house he had sealed and could not bear to enter. She understood, sitting there, that she was not a stranger who had blundered into this family's grief. She was the grief. She was the thing the money had been keeping. For 6 years, she had mourned a mother she believed had left her nothing but a scrap of tin and a silence too heavy to lift. Now the silence had a shape. Her mother had not come from nobody. Her mother had come from here, from this house, from this family, that had paid a lawyer 30 years over to pretend that neither of them had ever drawn breath. Sidney pressed the torn word flat beneath her cold fingers, that furious, tender, terrible mine, and found that she was shaking, and could not have said whether it was grief in her, or rage, or something far more dangerous that felt perilously like belonging. And somewhere down the black corridor, behind the one door in the house that no key would open, the old floor settled with a long, low groan, the way a house does in the killing cold, or the way it does when something on the far side of a locked door, having waited a very long time, shifts its weight at last to listen. Sidoni did not tell him. Not that night, and not the next. She told herself it was prudence. The birth record and the torn word and the lock of pale hair were the most dangerous things in the house, and until she understood what they meant, she would not lay them on the table between herself and a man whose whole life they might overturn. But under the prudence was something she was less proud of. The record said she was the old Duke's own, and for the first time in 18 years, she was somebody. And she wanted, just for a few days, to hold that against her heart in the dark before the world could take it from her or sharpen it into a knife. So she gave the Duke the truth she could prove and kept the truth she could not. She showed him the skimmed accounts, the phantom wages, the river of money running out of Wykehaven into Aldous Crake, and he grew very still and very cold and said, "We will hang him with it." And she agreed, and neither of them spoke of lockets or of chests with false bottoms. Crake did not wait for the fortnight to do his harm. He could not reach her at Marchmoor, so he reached the county instead. Within the week, the story had gone round every drawing room from the town to the coast, carried on the particular glee that respectable people keep for the ruin of a girl who has climbed above her station. There was a nameless creature at Marchmoor, it was said, a foundling of no birth and less shame, who had got her hooks into the poor scarred Duke and meant to have his fortune. Questions were being asked, it was said, about who she truly was, and whether Manor was even her name. The vicar's wife, who had once left a card, sent a servant to take it back. And one gray morning, a letter came with no direction and no signature, only 3 words in a clerk's disguised hand. Go or drown. Sidoni read it standing in the cold hall and waited to feel afraid, and found instead that she felt almost calm. She had been nobody her whole life. She knew the shape of nobody the way a sailor knows the sea. What could the county take from a girl who had come to it with 4 shillings and a dead woman's locket? Their good opinion was a coin she had never once been permitted to spend, and she did not intend to start grieving the lack of it now. She fed the letter to the parlor fire and watched the 3 words blacken and curl. "Let them talk," she said aloud, to the empty room, to the house, to the sealed door at the end of the corridor. "I have work to do." And she went back to the muniment room and took up her pen, because the numbers did not care what she was called, and the truth, when she had finished assembling it, would not care either. She did not know, bent over her columns, that Crake had already stopped trusting rumor to do his work. She did not know that a hard man was on the northern road that very hour, with money in his pocket and a set of instructions, and orders to be at Marchmoor before the week was out. He came on a Wednesday, when the Duke was away at the court, and he did not knock. Sidoni heard the front door go, the good hinges she had oiled herself, and then boots in the hall, unhurried, the tread of a man walking through a house he had already decided was his. She came out of the muniment room with the ink still wet on her fingers, and found a stranger standing in the middle of the great hall, with his hat still on, turning slowly on his heel to take the measure of the place. He was neither young nor old, dressed in decent black, gone shiny at the elbows, with a long, pale face, and eyes the flat gray color of dishwater. He looked like a clerk, and moved like something that hunted, and when he saw her, he smiled with only the lower half of his face. "Miss Manor," he said, "or so we are calling ourselves this season. My name is Sleeth. I am come on behalf of Mr. Aldous Crake to examine the accounts of this estate and to inspect the house." He let the words sit a moment. "All of the house. I did not admit you," Sidoni said, "and you will not inspect so much as the coal scuttle. This is private property, and I am its owner, and you will turn about and take yourself back down that rise before I have you taken." "Taken," he repeated, as though the word were charming. "By whom, my dear?" He began to walk, slow and easy, toward the mouth of the corridor, toward the muniment room, toward the sealed door beyond it, as if she had not spoken at all. There is a room in this house that Mr. Crake has an interest in. An old room, kept locked. You will give me the key to it, or I will find it in my own way. And I will tell you plainly, I am not gentle with houses, and I am less gentle with the young women who clutter them. Sidoni stepped into the mouth of the corridor and stood there, slight and cold and alone, and though her heart was going like a trapped bird, she did not give back so much as an inch. "There is no key," she said, "and were there 100 keys, you would have none of them. But I will tell you what I find remarkable, Mr. Sleeth. I find it remarkable that a man should send a thief-taker 200 miles at his own expense to break into one particular room of a house he swears is worthless. What is in the room? Do you even know? Or does your master keep his own dogs in the dark and only whistle them when there is something to be dug up?" Something moved in the flat gray eyes, and she saw that she had guessed rightly. He did not know. That was worth having, and she filed it away even as he came on. He crossed the last of the floor between them in 2 strides and took her by the arm, and his grip was cruel and meant to be, and he put his long, pale face down close to hers. "Now you will listen to me, girl," he began, and got no further. For Mrs. Truscott had come down the last of the stair without a sound, the way she did everything, and she had the old fowling piece from the gun room in her 2 hands, and she laid both cold barrels against the back of Sleeth's neck, just below the brim of his hat, and thumbed the hammers back with a click that was very loud in the silence. "The House of Wykehaven," she said, in a voice Sidney had never once heard from her, low and level and old as the moor, "is not yours to walk in, Ephraim Sleeth. I knew your father. He was a poacher and a coward, and he died in a ditch, and you are the smaller half of what he was. Take your hand off Anne's girl before I decide the magistrate can do without you." For a long moment nobody breathed. Then a third voice came from the open front door, quiet and even and far more terrible than any shout. "I would do as she asks," said the Duke of Wykehaven. "Mrs. Truscott has put 2 men under the turf of this moor that the law never troubled her about, and I should hate to see her lose the habit of restraint so late in a blameless life." Emrys stood in the doorway with the gray light behind him and both his gloves off, and his burned hand hung open and ready at his side, and there was nothing cold left in his face at all. There was only a still and dreadful readiness, the readiness of a man who had already decided how far he was willing to go and had found the answer restful. Sleeth let go of her arm as though it had grown hot. He gathered the rags of his dignity and set his hat straight and walked to the door with the fowling piece tracking every step of him. And there, of course, he turned, because his kind always turned to leave one last drop of poison on the step. "Mr. Crake comes himself on Friday," he said. "He knows what you are, girl, a deal better than you know it yourself, and when he has laid it out, there will not be a magistrate in England who calls this house yours, nor a soul who calls you anything but what you were born." Then he looked at the Duke, and his lip curled up off his teeth. "And he bade me remind your grace that he still holds the paper. He said you would take his meaning." Then he was gone into the wet afternoon, and they heard his horse strike off down the rise and dwindle into the wind, and the great hall was suddenly very cold and very quiet. "The paper," Sidoni said, into the quiet. "What paper?" "Your grace. What does that man hold over you that turns a duke to stone in his own hall?" But Emrys was not looking at her. He was looking down the length of the corridor at the sealed iron door, with the expression of a man who has watched, for 12 years, a coffin lid he nailed shut with his own hands, and has just seen it shift. He did not answer her question. He said only, half under his breath. Friday. Then we have until Friday. And Sidoni felt the cold drop through her all the way to the floor, because she understood him. Whatever waited behind that door, they were going to have to reach it before Aldous Craik did. The Duke did not ride back to the court that night. He sent Peggy out to the stable with his horse, and he stayed, for the first time in 12 years, under the roof of the house he had sealed and hated. And Sidoni measured what it cost him by the way he would not walk past the mouth of the sealed corridor, but went the long way round through the cold kitchens instead, as a man steps wide around a grave. She found him near midnight in the great front room, in the dark, sitting on the floor with his back against a chair, and his face turned to the low fire, the burned hand lying open and useless in his lap. A decanter stood beside him, but he had taken very little from it. He was not drinking to be drunk. He was drinking the way a man takes a bit between his teeth before the surgeon comes. "You should sleep," she said, from the doorway. "I cannot sleep in this house," he said, without turning. "I have not closed my eyes under this roof in 12 years, and I will not begin tonight." He gave a sound that was meant to be a laugh, and was not. "Do you know what day it falls on, Miss Marrow? This Friday of Craik's. Besides the day he means to finish us. It is 12 years to the very week since the fire. He will have counted it out on his fingers. He was always a man for anniversaries." Sidoni did not go to him with soft words, because she had learned young that soft words are what people give you instead of help. She crossed the room and knelt at the hearth and built the fire up herself, laying the wood the careful way he had laid it that stormy night, coaxing it high and hot, and then she went to the cold larder and came back with bread and a wedge of Mrs. Truscott's hard cheese, and set them on the floor at his side, without a word about it. She poured herself none of the brandy, and offered to take none of his. She simply sat down a careful arm's length from him, near enough to be company, far enough to be safe, as once, long ago, she had learned to sit beside a dog that had been beaten, and she waited. He looked at the fire she had built him, and the plainness of it, the exact echo of his own first kindness, handed back without comment or claim, seemed to undo something in him that gentleness never could have. "Tell me about the fire," she said. And this time, in the dark, 12 years to the week, with a fire she had made throwing his ruined face into red relief, he did. "There was a woman kept in the East Wing," he said. "All my boyhood, I never once knew her name. I was mostly away at school, and when I came home there were passages of this house I was forbidden, and a servant, Truscott, who kept them locked, and a name that no one ever said aloud, not my father, not the servants, not once. I built a story for her, the way a lonely boy will, a mad aunt, a family shame. Every great house is supposed to have one, some poor, broken relation shut away for her own good, and I believed it, because it is easier to believe the lock is a kindness than to ask who turned the key." He drank a little. "I never wondered whether it was good. I never wondered whose good." The fire ticked. Down the corridor the old house settled and groaned. "Then I came home the black heart of the winter. I was 19, he said, and his voice had gone very flat and very careful, the voice of a man carrying something across ice, and the East Wing was burning. Nobody would go in. The servants stood on the lawn and wailed, and my father stood among them and did nothing. Nothing. He only stared up at the flames, with a face I did not know. So I went in, to be brave, in the stupid showing way a boy is brave when he thinks his father is watching. I went up the burning stair, and at the top of it there was a door, and I broke it. And behind it was not a mad old aunt at all. She was not old. She was thin and gray and gentle, and so frightened. And when I took her hand, this hand, she said. "Thank you," as if no one had done her a kindness in a very long time. And we got halfway down the stair. He stopped. And then the stair was not there anymore, and there was a great heat. And I woke on the wet lawn with my face and my hand like this, and my father weeping over me. And she was still inside, and I had not even learned her name. He turned his scarred face full to Sidonie at last, and his pale eyes were wet, and did not care that they were. "My father sealed the ruin of the wing that same week," he said, "and the corridor that fed it, and sent me abroad to heal or to die. He did not much seem to mind which. And when I came home a year later, he had aged into an old man, and we never spoke of her, because I had no name to speak, and he would not give me one. I have hated this house 12 years, Miss Marrow, because it is the grave of the one person I ever managed to save the whole way to the bottom of the stair, and then could not save the last 6 feet. And I was never even permitted to lay a flower. Sidonie had gone very cold and very still, and it had nothing to do with the fire she had built. The softest voice, she said, thin and gray and gentle. And her hair, fair, he said, not understanding. Fair, going gray at the temple. Why do you look like that? Why? But she was already on her feet. She crossed to the corner where she had hidden the chest with the false bottom, and she brought it back and knelt down in front of him, closer than she had ever knelt. And she opened her 2 cold hands over the firelight and showed him what she had kept from him for a week. The lock of pale, fine hair, tied with faded thread. The unsent letters in a dying man's shaking hand. And the record of a birth, with the mother's name written plain. Anne. I think I know her name, Sidonie said, and her own voice broke on it, the first time it had broken in years. I think it was Anne. I think she was my mother. I think you carried my mother halfway down a burning stair when I was 6 years old, and 100 miles from here being told she was a seamstress with a fever. I think every soul I have ever met has lied to me about where I came from. And I think the last of the answer has been sitting behind that iron door the whole of my life, waiting for someone poor enough, or stubborn enough, or free enough to come and turn the key. The Duke looked at the lock of pale hair lying across her palm, and then he looked up at her own hair, pale and fine and loose about her face in the firelight. The very same, and the last of his terrible control came apart. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, a long, deep, silent crack opening clean across him. He lifted the burned hand, the hand that dead woman had held on the burning stair, and with the ruined, stiff fingers of it, he touched, very lightly, a strand of Sidonie's hair where it had fallen, as gently as if it too might take light and be lost. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing in the world that needed saying. The whole vast, cruel machine of the house, the lie and the fire, and the locked door, and the neat gray man riding north to bury the 2 of them together, seemed for one held breath to stop its grinding. And there was only the fire, and the pale hair, and a boy and a girl the same house had broken in 2 different years, sitting close enough at last to be warm. And then, from the far end of the sealed corridor, in the dead black middle of the night, something scratched at the iron door. Slow, deliberate, patient, as though, after 12 years, it had heard them coming and was answering. They didn't sleep. They sat up with every lamp in the house burning against that patient scratching, and in the gray before dawn, Sidonie went to the kitchen and found Mrs. Truscott already there, bolt upright at the scrubbed table with her hands folded before her, as though she had sat so all night, waiting to be asked the question she had waited 30 years to answer. You knew, Sidonie said, and sat down across from her. From the very first night. When you saw the locket on the step, you looked at me with pity, and it frightened me, and I didn't know why. You knew whose child I was. I served her, the old woman said, and all the flint was gone out of her voice, and underneath it, there was nothing but a grief worn smooth as a stair by 30 years of feet. I was Anne Reeves' maid before ever I was this house's jailer. I dressed her hair, that color, your color, when she was a girl no older than you are now. When the young Duke married her, in secret, in the dark, in the little chapel at the edge of the estate, with only me and a frightened sexton to see it done, it was my hands that pinned her veil. And when his family learned of it, and called it a madness, and broke him to their will, and hid her away in the East Wing, and gave it out that she was a poor, mad relation, it was I who went with her, because a woman cast into a locked room should have one living soul who remembers she is a woman and not a secret. I kept her 30 years. I kept her room, and then I kept her grave, and then I kept her door, because I had promised her I would keep faith, and there was no one left in the world to keep faith with but a padlock and a ghost. She lifted her eyes. When you stood on that step, girl, with her face and her hair and her poor tin locket at your throat, I thought the good Lord had sent the dead back to walk, and I did not know whether to bless him or curse him for it. She reached into the gray stuff of her bodice and drew out a small iron key, blackened, worn soft and shining at the ward, with 30 years of a thumb passing over it, and she laid it on the scrubbed table between them. I have the key, she said. I have always had the key. His Grace, the old Duke, believed the fire took it, and I let him believe it, and I have kept it against the one day that one of her own blood might come home and have the right to turn it. It is yours now, Anne's girl. It was always going to be yours. I only had to live long enough to give it to you. Aldous Craik came at noon, as he had promised, in a good carriage behind a good pair, and he came smiling. He was a smaller man than his long shadow, neat and gray and soft, and he walked into the great hall of Marchmoor as a man walks into a room he has already inherited, and looked about him with the mild contentment of a creditor come to collect. The Duke stood by the cold hearth. Sidoni stood at his side. Mrs. Truscott stood at the foot of the stair with her hands folded, and if Craik noticed the old servant at all, he did not think to fear her. Your Grace, Craik said, and bowed. And the young person. I shall be brief, for I am a busy man, and this is a cold house. He drew from his breast a folded paper, yellow with age, and held it up between two soft fingers, so the daylight showed the seal. This is the record of a marriage, secret and entirely lawful, made 30 years since between the late Duke of Wykehaven and one Anne Reeve, spinster, of no family whatsoever. It has been in my keeping, and my late father's before me, since the hour the ink was dry. He turned upon Emrys a look of gentle, dreadful pity. Your father took a second wife, your Grace, while the first yet lived and breathed in his own East Wing, which makes the late Duchess, your mother, no wife at all, and makes you no Duke, but only the base-born get of a bigamist, with no more claim to the coronet of Wykehaven than the scullery maid you have taken to keeping at your side. He folded the paper away against his heart. For 30 years I have held my tongue on this, and been paid to hold it, handsomely, out of the estate, as is only just. So, here are my terms, and they are kind ones. The girl signs Marchmoor over to me, and takes herself out of England forever. And you, your Grace, go on being called a duke, and go on paying me for the pleasure of it, quietly, until one of us is buried. Refuse, and I lay this paper before the crown, and the newspapers on one and the same morning, and by nightfall you are base-born, and she is a beggar, and I am simply a man who did his duty too late." The hall was silent. Aldous Craig had laid down the one card he had held for 30 years, the card that had never once failed to take the trick, and he waited, soft and certain, for it to win. Sidonie looked up at the Duke, and the Duke looked down at her, and she watched him understand exactly what she was about to do, and watched him choose, with a small, still nod that only she could see, not to stop her, though it might cost him the only name he had ever been given. "That is a very fine paper, Mr. Craig," Sidonie said, "but it is only a copy." "Is it not?" She let the words settle in the cold air. "It is the copy you have used to bleed this family white for 30 years. And the trouble with a copy, Mr. Craig, is that it is worth precisely nothing the moment the original walks back into the light." She turned her head. "Mrs. Truscott, open the door." The old woman went down the sealed corridor, with the blackened key held before her like a candle, and they all followed. Every one of them, even Craig, whose soft gray face had gone the color of tallow, and who came because he could not help it. The key screamed in the great padlock, the chain fell rattling to the stone, and the iron door, swollen fast in its frame for 12 winters, gave all at once to the Duke's good shoulder and swung inward on darkness, and out of that darkness, in a sudden clattering storm of gray wings, burst a jackdaw that had nested in the fire-broken roof above, and lived its whole small hidden life shut in that dark, and it beat once about their heads and found a broken window and was gone, out into the free gray air over the moor. That was the scratching. That was all it had ever been. A living thing, shut in the dark by other people's secrets, worrying at the door, only wanting to be let out. Beyond the door lay a small room the fire had somehow spared, kept just as it had been left. A narrow bed made up, a sewing table drawn to the boarded window where the best light would once have fallen. A child sampler upon the wall, the alphabet worked in fading silks and left unfinished at the letter S, and on the table, in a plain deal box, lay the true marriage lines, signed and witnessed and sealed, and 30 years buried, and beside them a thick fold of paper, covered in the shaking hand of a dying man. It was the old Duke's confession, written in his last months, when he had at last run clean out of years in which to go on being a coward. It set down the whole of it, the secret marriage and the cowardice, the locked wing and the long cruelty of it. And it set down, in words that had plainly cost him more than his life, the thing that mattered most to the girl reading it over Emrys's arm, that Anne, cast off but never freed, had in her long hidden loneliness found a little human comfort with a good plain man, a groom named Manor, dead these many years, and had borne a daughter by him, a child the family had taken from her arms as a babe, and put out to be raised 100 miles distant, in ignorance of them all, so that the secret should stay buried, and that the girl was no blood of the Duke's at all. He had written the word, mine, upon her birth record. The confession said, not because she was his, for she was not, but because he could not look upon the ruin he had made of Anne's whole life and her child's, and not claim the wreck of it as his own doing. The girl was his to have protected, and he had failed her as he had failed her mother, and he begged, in the last line, in a hand barely able to hold its letters, the forgiveness of Sidonie Manor, whom he had never dared to meet, and to whom he left the one house that held the truth, so that she might one day open the door he never could. Sidonie read it once, and understood at last that she was not the daughter of the man who had wronged her mother, but the daughter of the woman he had wronged, which was a cleaner and a truer thing to be. And she folded the confession and looked up, and turned to Aldous Crake, who stood in the doorway of the little room, with his soft mouth working and no sound coming out of it. "I have the original marriage lines, Mr. Crake," she said, without a scrap of triumph in it, only a great and level weariness. "I have the old Duke's own confession, sealed and witnessed, and I have every crooked farthing of your 30 years of theft written out fair in a hand that any jury in England can read. For I have had a whole cold winter with nothing to do but read your arithmetic. You did not come here today to threaten a duke. You came at long last into a house that is nothing from cellar to roof but your own rope, and you put your neck through the noose of your own accord, and I have only to let you feel the drop." She stepped back from him. "You may go to London if you like, but I think you will find the magistrate is already in the lane, for his grace sent a rider at first light, and I do not think, Mr. Crake, that you will care for the accommodation there." Aldous Crake did not go to London. He went, white and stumbling, and 30 years too late for mercy, out of the little room and down the corridor and out into the cold lane, where the magistrate's men stood waiting by his own good carriage, and the neat gray spider, who had held a whole dukedom trembling in his soft white hands, was helped up into a common cart like any other thief and carried away down the rise. And the last sound he heard, as the cart went from the gate, was the wind off the moor, and somewhere high above it, wheeling free in the gray, the harsh, glad cry of a jackdaw that had got out at last. It should have been the end. The villain was carried off. The long lie was broken open to the daylight. The door stood ajar at last, and the dark behind it was only a small, sad room and an empty bird's nest. But the truth, once it is let out, does not care in the least whether you are ready to go on living beside it. And when the sound of the cart had died away, Sidoni and Emrys stood alone together in the little spared room, with everything at last said aloud, and nothing at all settled between them. "You are not a duke," she said. She did not say it to wound him. She said it because it was the fact of him now, and they had had enough between them of things left unsaid. The marriage was real. Your mother was no wife. Everything you were born to, everything you were raised to carry, all of it stands on a paper that says you are no one. And I am the one holding the paper." "Yes," said Emrys. He stood very straight and still, a man taking a blow on purpose, refusing himself the mercy of a flinch. "You are. And I find, standing here, that I am not afraid of it. I have been the Duke of Wickhaven 12 years, and it has bought me a burned house, a name I could not sleep beneath, and a grave I was forbidden to weep at." He looked at the paper in her hand. "Take it to the Crown tomorrow, if you wish. You would be within every right a wronged woman ever had. Your mother was the true and lawful lady of this family, and you are her only living child, and I am the son of the woman who was put into her place. If you have a mind to see the house of Wickhaven brought down into the dirt, where it has earned its rest, Sidoni, you need only open your hand and let the wind take that paper." "Is that truly what you think of me?" she said, and the heat came up in her now, quick and bright. "That I dragged myself the length of England, that I sat a whole black winter in the cold, with your family's guilt piled on the table in front of me, so that, at the end of it, I might have the pleasure of pulling a roof down on your head." She was weeping again, and she let the tears come, furious and hot. "You carried my mother down a stair of fire. You have hated yourself 12 years for a woman you were not even allowed to name. And now, you stand there in her very room and offer me your ruin, as if ruin were the whole of what you had to give me, as if I had come all this way, wanting to be handed one more broken thing to keep." "Then tell me what," he said, and his voice cracked straight across. and the last of the great cold control of him broke the way the iron door had broken, all at once, after 12 years of holding. "What is it you want of me, Sidoni? For I do not know how to give you the only thing I truly owe you, which is your mother, alive, and out of that fire. And every other thing I own feels like an insult set beside it. Tell me. Tell me what a man is meant to offer the daughter of the woman he could not save." "Stay," she said. He went utterly still. "You told me you could not sleep in this house," she said, and dragged the back of her ink-stained hand across her wet cheek and left a dark smudge there she never knew about. "That you have hated it 12 years. Then stay in it. Stay, and help me turn it back from a grave into a house. My mother died, with her hand in yours, Emrys, which means that in all this cold world, you are the one living soul who has grieved her as long and as hard as I have, without even a name to grieve. I don't want your dukedom. I have never once in my life wanted a single thing I had not earned with my own 2 hands, and I am not about to begin with a coronet." She stepped in close to him, as close as she had knelt that night by the fire. "I want the one man in all of England who looked at a nobody scrubbing out a dead man's ruin, and did not throw her a coin, and did not throw her out, but knelt down at a cold hearth with his own broken hand, and built her a fire. That is the whole of what I want. Stay, Emrys. That is all I am asking. Just stay." He looked at her a long moment, and the last of the winter went out of him, and what was left underneath was young, and worn thin, and unbearably full of hope, the ghost of the boy who had run into a burning house because he could not leave a stranger to burn alone. He did not go down upon one knee, for neither of them had any use for the theater of it. He took both her cold hands into his, the whole hand and the ruined one together. "Then I will give you the one thing that is honestly mine to give," he said, "which is myself, whatever a jury may decide that is worth. Marry me, Sidoni Marrow, not to make a duchess of you, for I may have no rank left to lend, and not to mend your name, for you have never once in your life needed mending. Marry me because you walked into the coldest place I know, carrying a dead woman's locket and a winter's worth of stubbornness, and you have been the only warm thing in 12 years of my life, and I am tired past bearing of being cold." "Yes," she said, before he had the whole of it out. "Yes." And she went up into his arms in her mother's room, with the door standing open behind them, and the free air coming through it at last, and neither of them was cold any more. They were married in the spring, in the small gray chapel at the edge of the estate, where 30 years before, a duke had wed a seamstress in the dark, with only a maid and a frightened sexton to witness it, so that the same old walls that had once been made to keep a secret might see this time a promise made in